All right, welcome. My name is Morgan Greenleaf. I'm the Program Manager of Innovation Catalyst with the Georgia CTSA, and I'm glad to host this Bench2Market talk on FDA regulatory strategy, medical device, and in vitro diagnostics. The Bench2Market talk series is co-sponsored by Biolocity, the Pettit Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience at Georgia Tech, and the Georgia Clinical and Translational Science Alliance, or GTSA. One thing we wanted to make you aware of is we have the Bio Launchpad Commercialization Workshop coming up, which is sponsored by IVB at Georgia Tech. This is March 9th. You can scan the little QR codes here, or I will drop the link in the chat in a few minutes when we get started. Also, if you want to mark your calendars, and I'll also drop into chat, the next Bench2Market talk is about building a compelling pitch and communicating your go-to-market strategy. That'll be on March 22nd from 11:30 to 12:30. And we have a longtime speaker, Brian Walsh and Keaton Weisinger. They'll present example pitches and how to pitch. And so make sure to come to that. So today's speaker is Sandra Maher, and she is a regulatory affairs consultant for medical devices, in vitro diagnostic assays, instruments, and reagents. She has over 20 years of experience in medical device and in vitro diagnostic regulatory affairs, quality assurance, and clinical affairs. She's led and managed large multifunctional projects covering medical devices, IVDs, companion diagnostics, and combination products, resulting in the successful launch of over 100 medical devices and IVDs. It's super wonderful to have you here with us, Sandra, and I will switch to your slides to begin the talk.
Thank you.
And while I'm doing that, everyone who is joining us, if you have questions, you can ask those questions in the chat or the Q&A function, and we will answer those questions at the end of the talk. If the question is pertinent to the slide itself, then we may ask that question during the talk, but feel free to put them there and we'll get to them at the end. All right, how's that look?
Very good. Thank you, Morgan.
Go for it.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. So during today's discussion, I will provide you with a short introduction of how to market your medical device or in vitro diagnostic product in the US. So really, this is your first steps in deciding how the FDA regulations affect your product. And as Morgan explained, I'm Sandra Maher, and I'm an independent regulatory affairs consultant. Next slide, please. So as I've explained, the goal of today's presentation is I will first explain the FDA's role in regulating medical devices. Next, we will review the actual definition and some basics about device classification. We will describe the pathways to get a new product to market and different types of pre-market regulatory submissions that you may send to the FDA. We will also examine the quality systems regulation and post-market requirements, and then we'll go over some key takeaways from today's discussion. Next slide, please. So first, I think we can start by looking at the FDA's mission. And so the FDA is a consumer protection agency in the US federal government. And their mission is really to promote and protect the public's health. And the scope of what they regulate covers medical devices and in vitro diagnostics, which we're talking about today. And those products are actually regulated by the Centers for Devices and Radiological Health. So you may hear quite often about CDRH. And the FDA, in their mission, they actually evaluate the safety and effectiveness of medical devices before they get to market. So while your product is in development, the FDA, you have to do some testing to do that evaluation, but the FDA will do the review to look at safety and effectiveness. And they also want to ensure that the products, when they go on the market, they also remain safe. So the mission really is to advance public health. And at the same time, they help to speed innovations in order for us to receive timely and continued access to safe and effective, as well as high quality medical devices and IVDs. So really, if you look at the FDA's website, you can review this mission statement. Next slide, please. So here we have a brief history of the laws at FDA. What laws actually govern the medical devices that we're putting on the market? So the first thing we need to review is in 1976, there was the Medical Device Amendments to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And in this act, the FDA, it talks about how the FDA regulates medical devices. And this is where the laws were actually originated. And then in 1990, there was the Safe Medical Device Act, which actually improved the post-market surveillance responsibilities of the FDA. And also there's some definition about substantial equivalence. So when we talk about the 510K program, oftentimes there is a description about substantial equivalence because your test has to be substantially equivalent to a legally marketed device. And this was written in the 1990 Safe Medical Devices Act. In 2002, the FDA presented the Medical Device User Fee Modernization Act. So this is called MDUFMA. And in this act, the FDA was granted the authority to collect user fees. So those applications that you sent into the FDA, such as a 510K or PMA, there are fees associated with them. And the FDA actually started collecting fees because they wanted to be able to improve the efficiency, quality, and predictability of medical device submissions review. Moving on to 2012, we will see that there was the Food, Drug, and Safety Innovation Act, and this created the de novo pathway for novel devices. And these devices are new. There are no other such devices on the market. So if you have a product that's a novel technology and it's new, and we can talk about this a little later, then your regulatory pathway will be the de novo submission pathway. And then in 2016, we have the 21st Century Cures Act, which really mandated the creation of the revision for policies intended to speed patient access to new medical devices. Next slide, please. So I think the biggest question we always have is my product a medical device? We always want to know that upfront. So if you have a product that you're working on, this is the first step that you need to take. You need to ask yourself, do you really have a medical device? And this definition is actually stated in Section 201H of the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. And it defines a medical device as any instrument, apparatus, machine, IVD, including its component or accessory that is intended to diagnose, cure, or mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease, and it affects the structure or function of the body. But it's very important that we note that this does not include a product that its primary intended purpose is through a chemical action, because would be, for example, a drug. So medical devices do not include those types of products. And also for software functions such as data storage support and electronic records. Oftentimes we get a little caught up, hung up over those, whether or not they're medical devices, but some of these software function, a lot of them actually, if this is the function they're performing, they're actually excluded. They're not medical devices, and we'll talk about those a little more. Next slide, please. So for software functions, these are actually written in section 520 of the Act. And in this section, the FDA states that if you have a software that's for administrative support only for a healthcare facility, for example, including if it's processing and maintaining financial records or claims or billing information or appointment schedules, this is actually not considered a medical device. Also, if the software function is for maintaining or encouraging a healthy lifestyle, this is not a medical device, but it has to be unrelated to diagnosis, cure, mitigation, prevention, and treatment. So if you remember, in the definition of a medical device, we have these words and terminologies. So if you have a software that's simply maintaining or encouraging a healthy lifestyle, it's not a medical device and can be marketed as such. But if you have claims for diagnosis or cure or anything like that in the intended use of the product, then you have actually tripped the limitation, and now your product is in fact a medical device. If your product serves as an electronic patient records or patient provided information, then it's not considered a medical device. And if you're transferring, storing or converting or displaying any clinical lab test data, then in that case, your software is not a medical device. It's just functioning as a software. It's not a medical device. Next slide, please. So oftentimes we get a lot of questions about medical mobile applications. So for this one, I wanted to refer you to the FDA's guidance document, and it's called the Policy for Device Software Functions and Mobile Medical Applications, Guidance for Industry and Staff. And in this medical mobile application guidance, it states that some of the software functions do not meet the device definition, including the ones that I just talked about, and these are not subject to applicable FDA regulatory requirements. So it's very important that when we look at our intended use and we examine carefully the product that we're marketing, that we ensure whether or not it falls into the definition of a medical device. But just for our information, the FDA's oversight or about software is mainly based on the software function. So it's focused on functionality. So it's important that we understand how the software functions in order to determine whether or not it's a medical device. Next slide, please. So wanted to talk a little about in vitro diagnostics, especially now that, we just got out of a pandemic and COVID. So there is a definition of IVD in 21 CFR Part 8093. And the definition of an in vitro diagnostics is any reagents, instruments, and systems that is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other condition in order to cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent disease. And also, if the IVD is intended for use in collection or to prepare samples or to examine samples that are taken from the human body, then those collection or preparation or specimens are also part of the in vitro diagnostic systems. And these IVD products, they are often used in the labs So when you go to the doctor's office and you do a blood test, if you, the nurse, while she's pulling the blood into those tubes, the samples are sent to the labs to be tested, and also at healthcare settings. So you can go into the doctor's office and right there, the nurse can use some of these IVD kits, or at home. So recently you're receiving your COVID kits at home. There are pregnancy kits that you can use at home, and there are also glucose monitors. So these are actually some of the examples of in vitro diagnostic devices. Next slide, please. So the big question, I think, and the reason why everyone joined the call today is just to get some understanding of how to get a new product to market. And in order for you to get those answers, we first have to ask ourselves some important questions. So, you know, we talk about this already. Is your product a medical device? So you need two frameworks in order to answer that question. You need a device description, and you also need an intended use, because in order to answer the question about a medical device, it's based on the device description as well as the device intended use. And then we have to get into, there are regulatory controls which the FDA put in place, and we have to figure out if those controls are applicable for our device. We have to ask ourselves if our device is a class 1, 2, or 3, and that's the way FDA classifies devices into 3 classes. And then we will get a unique product code that would be specific for our device and our device type. Next slide, please. So this is really the regulatory process steps that we would normally go through. When we put together a regulatory strategy, we would answer the question about the device description. Then we'll talk about the device purpose and its function. What is the intended use? How is the product going to be used? And then we talk about the indications for use and the intended patient population. And the intended patient population will include the age of the patients who are going to be using the device, as well as the specific disease condition that we're targeting. And then we will get into the device classification. And I will walk you through how we can determine the regulatory classification and the different paths to market. In order for us to get the product on the market, we need to collect valid scientific evidence. And this is described in 21 CFR part 806.7, where the FDA talks about what sort of bench or non-clinical or analytical studies we need to conduct. And then we also have to collect clinical data to support our devices. And then we have to prepare what's called a pre-market submission. And then we will send the packet to the FDA. Next slide, please. So devices are classified in 3 classes, class 1, class 2, and class 3. And these are all based on risk. So the lowest class that we have is class 1, which is the lowest risk. And for this class, we have what are called general controls. And these have to be sufficient in order for us to have assurance of safety and effectiveness. Most class 1 devices are exempt, meaning we do not have to send in a pre-market notification to the FDA. And I think a lot of developers, they really like to hear that their products are exempt because they don't want to go in front of the FDA with a submission. But in order for you to have an exempt product, it has to, the intended use has to be low risk. And then we make a determination as to what sort of controls are applicable for that device. The second class is the class 2 moderate risk devices. And for these ones, the general controls are also applicable. But then there are special controls, and these special controls are usually device specifics. And I'll go into the different types of controls just so you see how they work and which ones would be applicable to your device. A few of these class 2 products may be exempt, but they may have been down classified by the FDA. They may have been initially class 2, but now they're class 1 exempt. But generally speaking, all class 2 devices require a 510K pre-market notification submission to the FDA. And for new novel devices, we have what's called a de novo submission, which I'll explain later on. And these are whenever there are no similar products on the US market, then your product will be considered new or novel. And we would send in a request for a de novo, and the FDA would assign a product code for this new product type. And then the class 3 products, of course, those are the highest risk. These have general controls, but also there are PMA specific controls. And the marketing application is called a pre-market approval application. So here I just put an asterisk for the most common type. In the class 1, it would be exempt. Class 2, 510K, and class 3 would be PMA. Hi, Morgan.
We do have one question, and maybe you'll get to this later, but could you provide any examples of class 1 and class 2? Some simple examples?
Yes, I have another slide further on with some examples of based on the different classes. Perfect.
Okay, great.
Yes, so for regulatory controls, we have what we're calling general controls. And these are the basic provisions that provide the FDA with the means of regulating devices to ensure their safety and effectiveness. So these include, for example, all products must have labeling. So they must have a package insert that explains to the user how to use the product. And these are the regulation that's applicable for labeling is 21 CFR Part 801. Then another general control is medical device reporting. So under 21 CFR Part 803, if there are problems in the field or any issues with the product in QC, or we have to make sure we have a mechanism to report those issues to the broader audience and to the FDA so they can be aware that there are problems with the device. Also, manufacturers and distributors and other entities are required to register and list with FDA, and this is shown under 21 CFR Part 807. So if you're a manufacturer or a distributor, you need to check to see if you need to register and list with the FDA. And then there's the quality system regulation. And I think if you have, whether or not it's an exempt product or a class 2 or class 3 product, you need to set up a quality system and decide, make a decision based on the risk, which sections are applicable for your device. Next slide, please. For regulatory controls that are called special controls, these are the ones where the general controls alone are insufficient to provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. And special controls usually, when they're combined with general controls, they provide the reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. So device specific controls include what are called performance standards. And then there are post-market surveillance requirements when your product is on the market. They include patient registries. There might be some special labeling requirements that applies to your device that you need to, it could be some warnings or precautions that you have to include in the labeling. And there are pre-market data requirements. So there might be specific, based on the specific device you have, there could be scientific data that is relevant during your testing that you must do. For example, there could be cross-reactivity studies that you may have to perform for an IVD, for example, but there could be specific pre-market data requirements. And then usually for these special controls class 2 devices, there are guidelines that we have to follow, or we are recommended that we follow these guidelines, or FDA guidance documents that are published on these type of devices. Next slide, please. So the question then is, how do I classify my product? And what I did on this slide was I just went into the FDA's product classification database and printed the screenshot of, if you wanted to classify your device, how you can do it. So this is the first screen that I took from the FDA's product classification database. Next slide, please. So here is the quick search. If you look on that first screen, there's a button that you can click on and do a quick search. And depending on your product's intended use, what you can do here is to input the main focus of your test. So for this one, I did subcutaneous implantable as a search in the quick search. And when I click the search button, this is what comes up. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, this is telling you that in the FDA's database, there are many different product codes that are associated with this subcutaneous implantables. So if you are trying to decide which one fits your product best, then you should click on each product code that are listed here. And that will give you an idea of your product intended use, and it would sort of lay the foundation as to how you can market the device later on. So here there were 2 pages. I think there were 10 items, 10 different product codes associated with it. It doesn't mean that when you click on the product code, it's going to be all inclusive as to the product that you're considering. So in that case, you may trip the limitations of what's already in the system. But it still doesn't mean that you have a novel technology. What it means is that you will still have to go to the FDA and ask some questions, because none of these devices are actually like your own, or you may need to use multiple product codes in order to satisfy the requirements of your test. So next slide, please. So I used the LGK as an example. So I clicked on LGK from the previous screen, and this is what comes up. And what it's telling me that this is a catheter implanted subcutaneous intraventricular device. The specialty is neurology. The product code is LKG, but it's also telling me that the submission type is a 510K. The device is class 2. And so on and so forth. So the product code really is laying out the regulatory framework for your product. So it's important that you check them to see which one is most applicable for your device. And then to examine this further, what I did was I look at the regulation number. So the 882.550. Next slide, please. If you go to the next slide, yes, this slide. If you look at this slide, the identification here for this product code, for this regulation, is actually what you will be using in your intended use. So this describes exactly what's the intended use for these devices that are on the market. And then if the identification, if there's additional information based on the test that you are developing, if it's not here, then that's when you really would need to go to the FDA and ask a question because your device might be a little different from the intended use that is here. And as you can see, the classification, it's also telling you that there are performance standards that are applicable. So these are the regulatory controls. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we want to talk a little about the different types of pre-market submissions. So there are basically 5 main types of pre-market submissions that we would send to the FDA. So an investigational device exemption is usually used in clinical research on investigational devices. A pre-market notification, or 510K, is the market application for low and moderate risk devices. A pre-market approval application is a market application for highest risk devices. A de novo application is usually used for a novel device, and an HDE is when there are just about 8,000 individuals per year in the US that are affected by the disease. Then we would have a HDE application sent to the FDA. Next slide, please. So this is to give you a bit more flavor of what an IDE is. So you may have a device that you're working on. Usually IVDs are usually exempt from IDEs, but I've had situations where CBER, for example, for an HIV test kit, because it's such high risk, ask us to send in an IDE so we can get more comprehensive feedback. So for an IDE for a medical device, you would need to submit an IDE in order to do some clinical research on the device. You would use the data for safety and effectiveness collection. And then you also use the data in your future pre-market application. It does require an IRB review and approval of an IDE, but also the main goal of the IDE is to protect human subjects. So there are a lot of information. There's a lot of information usually in the IDE about how we can go about protecting human subjects in terms of case report forms and the way the protocols are written. The IRB would do a review ensuring that this protection is there. Next slide, please. For a 510K pre-market notification, I mentioned that these are for class 2 products and some class 1. For this type of application, we want to establish substantial equivalence between new device and a legally marketed device, which is called a predicate. We would compare the intended use of our new device to the device that's already on the market. We have to define our device features, and we have to conduct performance testing, such as bench studies and clinical studies. And some examples we have for these class 2s are blood glucose tests, endoscope, or ECG monitoring devices. So if you go on the FDA's website, there are a list. You can just Google 510K clearances for January, and you can see all the devices that have been cleared under the 510K process. Next slide, please. So pre-market approval applications, again, these are the highest risk devices, and this is the most stringent review at FDA. It's more rigorous than the 510K pathway, and it's applicable to class 3 devices. We have to show that there's reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, and we have to provide valid scientific evidence that stands on its own. This is not the same as substantial equivalence, because if you remember, for the 510K pathway, we are comparing head to head with a predicate device, a device that's already on the market. But with a PMA, you have to show that this product can stand on its own. So it's not the same comparison. And here are some examples. We have like an HIV assay or a lab test that detects a specific mutation. And then we have an ablation catheter or prosthetic stent. So these are some examples of PMA products. For the de novo submission, this is for a device that has no existing classification or regulation. So the marketing process is for novel devices, and we want to classify devices into either a class 1 or class 2. So whether or not you think the product is exempt or not, if there's not a product code associated with the product and you want to sell the product as a medical device, but it's new, we still need that classification under the de novo submission framework. So the review is based on a determination of a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. And then if your de novo request is granted, this now creates a new classification regulation and a 510(k) pathway for subsequent devices of the same type. So your de novo device then would be the first predicate device for the other companies that are going to come along. And if you want to look at the de novo requirements, it's codified under 21 CFR 860 subpart D. Next slide, please. And lastly, we want to talk about the humanitarian device exemption, or an HDE. And this is a pre-market submission for humanitarian use. And it's for a disease that's affecting less than 8,000 individuals that are in the US. And we just have to prove reasonable assurance of safety and probable benefit for this type of submission. We want to just talk briefly about the quality system regulations. And it tends to be a little confusing because a lot of individuals may believe that the QSR does not apply if they have an exempt product. This is not true, because if you are making and selling a medical device in US, the QSR actually governs the methods and the facilities and the controls that are used for your design, manufacture, packaging, labeling, storage, installation, and servicing. And it's for all finished devices that are intended for humans. So it's very important that you understand how the QSR applies to your device. So every manufacturer must develop a quality system that's consistent with the risk that's presented by their device. So the regulation is found under 21 CFR Part 820, and it's harmonized with the International Standard Organization, ISO 9001, as well as ISO 1345. So if your company or your facility is currently ISO 9001 or ISO 1345, there are ways you can leverage the information that you currently have to match with 21 CFR Part 820 because they're harmonized. Next slide, please. So a little bit about post-market surveillance. All companies involved in manufacturing and distribution of devices must follow certain requirements and regulation once devices are on the market. So you are required to have a tracking system. There is a unique device identifier or identification that's required for devices, and how it's placed and what you do is based on the type of device that you're marketing. There are accredited bodies that the FDA is using who can help with those that part of the quality system. So it's important that you use those accredited organizations. So this post-market surveillance, you also have to report device malfunctions, any serious injuries or deaths, and also register and list your establishment where devices are produced and distributed. Next slide, please. So the key takeaways from today's talk, we talk about where medical devices are defined in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, that the FDA classified devices into 3 classes, 1, 2, and 3, based on risk. That the FDA has also established regulatory controls. There are special controls for the higher risk, moderate risk devices, and there are general controls for all devices. For the product that you have to have a defined intended use. It's very important that you clearly define what your intended use is. There are different types of pre-market submissions. We went over 5 of them. I know it was very quick. There are a lot more details. We could talk for the rest of the year about each one, but the FDA's website can provide you with a lot more details on the different types of pre-market submission and what goes into each one of them. But it's important you develop a quality management system for your product and incorporate a post-market surveillance system. And of course, you can consider further assistance if necessary. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sandra.
You're welcome.
Super dense amount of information delivered there. So thank you so much. Just a reminder to everyone, if you want to ask a question, you can do so in the Q&A or in the chat, either one. But I'll actually start, Sandra, with a question that we did get. I'll stop my share from the audience, which is, the question is there any advantage for companies whose product receives predicate de novo? And what I think from Bill, I think what he's asking is if you're a de novo, is there some advantage to being a unique, to being first there?
Yeah, so that might just be a marketing strategy. If you're the only product on the market, it might just be a cost benefit. But as soon as you are a de novo or other company, it's not a patent or anything like that you're going to receive. You will just be the first product on the market, and other companies can use your device as a predicate device as soon as you're granted the de novo.
Got it. And I know I've seen previously that some companies, one of their devices is de novo and they follow it with their own devices as predicates with 510Ks. So I've seen that strategy as well.
Yes.
Another question coming in from William Bradley. When filing a de novo pathway, should you still try to find similar technologies to help the FDA classify or approve your new technology? Is this advantageous?
So I'm not sure. I think if you really want the FDA to understand your technology, as much information as possible, you should include as much information as you can in the either the pre-submission or in the application. So, so the first step for before we even file the de novo, if you think you have a de novo, would be for you to send in a pre-submission to the FDA to discuss your product and have the FDA agree on the regulatory pathway. So have the FDA say, yes, there are no other product like this on the market, and it is indeed a de novo submission. And then you will outline all the studies that you will be doing to support that marketing application in the pre-submission. And in that pre-submission as well, in order for the FDA to fully understand your technology, you can include all those different literature or whatever it is about the technology, so the FDA can get a better understanding as to what it is that you're doing with that test. And then when you send in the application, you can reference that pre-sub. So there probably would not be a need again to resend in all of those paperwork.
Got it. It actually leads to a general question that I wanted to ask on behalf of the audience, which is, we didn't talk much about timing and about when you should think about regulatory strategy and the pre-market submission or the pre-sub meeting. So maybe could you talk a little bit about when to consider in the product life cycle, from all the way from a bench, something, all the way through when you formed a company? Like when should you be thinking about these regulatory topics?
Yes, so there are different phases of development for your product. So I think as you get out of there's a concept phase where you may have a concept, but as soon as you get into the definition phase, and you're about to get into the verification phase, where you now have your design inputs and some of your design inputs, and you think you really have an intended use. And right as you're about to lock your design, it's better you go to the FDA in a pre-submission before you start doing the testing for the validation and the data that will be used to support the application, because you don't want to spend a lot of money doing all of those testing and then sending an application and then the FDA does not agree with your approach. So it's important that you get the pre-submission in before you start the validation study. So when your design is locked and you've established your design inputs, and you know what the output's going to look like and the intended use is confirmed, then you go to the FDA in a pre-sub before you start those validation studies.
Gotcha. Super helpful. I did want to go back also just to some examples of class 1 products. What are some examples of class 1?
So class 1 products include like a tongue depressor, any product that is really low risk, that is usually class 1. Yeah, so I think like a lot of the the only one I can think of right now is a tongue depressor.
Okay. I have a slightly provocative question for you, which is you've seen a lot of communication with the FDA, with many different companies. Could you give any examples of no-nos, of sort of mistakes that people make when dealing with the FDA?
I think we always have to think about the FDA's mission statement, that they're really just trying to protect, working hard to protect the public and to get innovations out to the public. So I think some of the no-nos, we have to realize that the FDA is on our side, and they are trying to get, if we have a product with valid scientific evidence, that they will work with us to get it on the market. I think oftentimes we go to the FDA too late. We may have conducted studies, we may have spent a lot of money, and when the FDA pushes back, then it causes a lot of anxiety, and we think that the FDA is not a good listener or something like that. But I think if we bear in mind what the mission statement is, we're confident that they're acting in our best interest.
Yeah, that is good advice. And having worked with the FDA a lot myself through RADx, they can be easy to work with. I know they have a mixed reputation. One question from the audience here is, can you change indication for use while the submission is ongoing with the FDA? And how do you know if a small addition change will not trigger additional clinical study data needs?
Yes, that's actually a great question. So as a manufacturer, you can do whatever it is that you think you need to do. But if you are going to make a change, it's important you communicate to the agency what you're intended to do, so you agree on the data that's going to be required. When it comes to deciding whether or not it's a major or minor change, you have to do that assessment through risk analysis. And there is a guidance document, an ISO standard 14971, which we normally would use to document our risk in terms of the product itself or the patients. And through that risk analysis, we'll do an assessment as to whether or not the change is significant. But the FDA also established guidance document for the decision-making process when you change your process or you change the device itself, what sort of decision tree you would need to go through to make a determination as to whether or not it's a significant change. For the specific question though, because the device is under review, if you make a change, it's important that you inform the FDA about that change, because the only reason why you would think it's important, it's because it would be significant. Whether or not it's going to impact the labeling, so the package insert or the labels may change. It may impact the QC results. It may shift. Something may change. If it's going to add a warning or precautions to the label based on that change, it's very important that you communicate that change to the FDA if the submission is under review.
Yeah, I think just underlining for the audience what you're saying repeatedly, which is communication with the FDA is a good thing and not something to be avoided. Cool. One more question. Awesome, William. For medical software, which will regularly be updated, how would you approach the FDA to reduce the number of resubmissions? This is a great question, one that we deal with all the time. What kind of updates would require resubmission?
So the updates for software that would require resubmission are usually the ones that we have to retrain the user how to use the device, because the interpretation of results is now different, or they have to look at something else. Even if the actual results remain the same, but the end user, there's some retraining of the end user. Usually those would involve resubmission to the FDA. But the FDA does expect constant review and updates of software, but it doesn't mean that all the software changes have to go back to the FDA. So again, it's important that we understand our software hazard analysis document, and we have to continue to use the 14971 guidance risk guidance document, because it's all based on risk. And we have to ask ourselves if the software updates result in, if they're raise new questions about safety and effectiveness. So if the answer to that is yes, then it means we have to go back to the FDA and inform them of the software changes. But there are many software guidance documents as well on the FDA's website that we should have used during the development of the software, and they're still valid when we put the device on the market, because any changes to the software, we have to go back and look at our master validation plan for that software, what we said we were going to do, and why we are now changing something. So yes, so the going back to FDA is all based on the significance of the change and whether there are any changes to safety and effectiveness based on that software change.
Got it. That's super helpful. Last question from me is about COVID and the pandemic, and the way that the FDA works does seem to have changed during the pandemic, specifically under the EUA process. So I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about what you've seen in your dealings with the FDA now that the pandemic is closing officially. Forgot the designation, the HHS designation. What have you seen change within the FDA? Is it going? What has changed during the pandemic, and do you think those changes will continue?
Well, I think there were some, I think when you're saying changes, there were a lot of, like the pre-sub review process was much slower because the FDA was busy with reviewing the EUAs. But I think everything has gone back to business as usual for the FDA when it comes to doing their reviews. The MEDUFMA goals are the same. They, there were updates based on the fiscal year, but I don't think and the structure over in FDA, the organizational structure may have changed a bit. But I think the review that we're seeing with 510Ks are consistent with what the agency's mission was before the pandemic. And they're working hard to put out guidance documents and framework for all the tests that are on the market.
Okay. Oh, one last question slipped in here. What types of applications can be automatically changed by FDA, like special to traditional? Are there any other de novo or 510K or PMA to 510K? So I guess this is asking about the FDA changing the pathway.
So when you get when you're granted a de novo, the next similar device would be a 510K for that device type. I don't know if that's what they're asking. But for PMA, there is a process where the FDA, if they have scientific knowledge, they can down classify a device, but that doesn't happen a lot. There are a lot of class 2s that were down classified as exempt as class 1. But I can't remember PMA. I think there was one that I've seen that was down classified from a PMA to a 510K. But that process takes a long time. There has to be a lot of data, and the FDA has to be confident that the risk, they have enough scientific information that the risk is no longer high, that it's moderate. It's not moderate to down classify from a 510K.
Pretty rare from the riskier categories. Awesome. Well, I think we'll end it here. Thank you so much, audience, for listening and for all your questions. That was wonderful, and thank you, Sandra, so much for joining us here. Great information. I'm sure the audience will ask, can we share your slides? We PDF them?
Yes, of course.
Wonderful. I will share that with with all those who registered. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
All right,
have a good day. Bye.